The subject of this video is arguably a horror game, and so there will be lots of generally disturbing themes and imagery. I'm also going to give specific warnings for blood and gore, albeit stylized and pixelated, as well as suicide. That said, this video will have no jump scares, I promise. When asked what my favorite video game is, I find myself having to take a pause. Because my favorite video game is Yume Nikki, the 2004 RPG Maker classic. But saying something's your favorite kinda comes with an implicit suggestion that whoever you're talking to should play it, right? And I feel like any recommendation of this game, despite its qualifications as a decade-old indie darling, needs qualifiers. Because it's a game defined by surreal and abrasive imagery, bizarre and confusing gameplay elements, and a total lack of any meaningful player communication, Yume Nikki completely obliterates most contemporary notions of game design and leaves you with a sometimes beautiful, oftentimes disturbing pile of an experience. But you can sink your teeth into it. Just like dreams, it doesn't tend to mean anything, but maybe, if you think about it in just the right way, it could mean something. It's one of the earliest examples of that particular game dev niche of abstract, high-concept experiences. I adore it, and find it to be an endlessly important countercultural touchstone in the medium. But also it looks like this, and plays like garbage, so clearly there's some explaining to do. But before we get into all of that, I encourage you guys listening to give the game a blind playthrough first. Thing is, I'm not saying to finish the game. I'm not even really saying you should play it for any significant amount of time, because as we're going to get into very soon, Yume Nikki is not an easy game to play for many reasons. It is, however, an easy game to download and get running. There's an officially translated download on Steam for free, as well as the original fan-translated release that started it all, also for free, both of which will be linked in the video's description. And it's so trivially small and low-tech that you could probably play this on like a graphing calculator. Like, this game was made in 2004, don't worry. What I suggest is to download the game, boot it up, and just walk around. See what you can find, see how you respond, and think about the crazy things you come across. Come at it with an open mind, and give it however much time you think it deserves. Once you're done, you're welcome to come back, and we can unpack all of what this game has going on. Because, by God, for something I described earlier as trivially small, there is so much going on. So, just to cover my bases and give anyone who might need it a refresher, here's what Yume Nikki is broadly about. You play as this girl who's referred to as Medotsky. That's probably not her name, we'll get to that. She refuses to leave her bedroom, and so there are only two things she can really do. The first is to load up a game called Nasu on the Famicom, which sure is a video game. Yup. Video gaming. Woo! The second, and much more interesting thing to do is to go to bed, upon which Medotsky will wake back up on what seems to be her balcony, but is actually part of the world of her dreams. Stepping outside, you find what the game calls the door room, and the fans usually call the Nexus, an assortment of doors leading to various themed worlds that make up the landscape of Medotsky's dreaming mind. Oh, we should probably bring up the thing with the names. With the exception of Medotsky and a few other characters, nothing really has an official name in Yume Nikki. Even internally, because of the way RPG Maker handles character sprites, there aren't any labels naming any characters. The developer just decided to throw everything haphazardly into character sheets that are labeled Event 1, Event 2, Event 27, and so forth. Very unhelpful, especially when you're faced with things like this and need to figure out what to even call it. It's a little bit better with the maps, but not much. They do have internal designations within the game's files, but most of them are split between being very generic and vague, or being named after one of the collectibles you can find in the area, which is how you get a world like this being called hairstyle? As a result of all this, the fanbase has devised commonly accepted names for most things in the game, as compiled in the Yume Nikki wiki, which I'll generally be using from here on out. Though, for the sake of being comprehensive, if something I mentioned does have an internal name, I'll place them in this sidebar here, along with a translation of the term. Moving on, these worlds are often massive, abstract environments full of strange decorations and characters, and they frequently connect to even stranger worlds through all sorts of gateways and portals. You can wake up at any time by pinching your cheek, upon which you can save at the desk by the bed, then go back to sleep and explore some more. There are often other characters in these worlds, but their behavior is hard to predict. Most of the time they'll do nothing and completely ignore you. Sometimes they'll play a sound or trigger some other small reaction, and some of them will even transport you to other worlds, like this stack of floating 3D objects that sends you to hell! A small number of them will give you abilities called effects, though these are similarly hard to predict. Some of them have very consistent and useful effects, like a bicycle that lets you get around faster, or an eyeball hand that lets you fast travel to the Nexus, while some of them have very specific abilities that are meant to bypass certain obstacles, like an umbrella that summons the rain, or a lamp to light dark spaces, except the lamp also replaces your body because it's that kind of game. But about half of them have no practical use whatsoever, and only do things like make your hair blonde, or turn you into a demon girl, or there's one that makes you wibble. Look at her wibble. You sure can wibble in this video game. The game tells you that you can drop your effects in the Nexus, upon which they'll turn into eggs, I guess, sure. What the game won't tell you is that by doing this with all 24 effects, something in the real world changes that gives you access to Yume Nikki's ending. Hey, real quick, final spoiler warning, I'm about to say what the ending is, so last chance to play the game for yourself and find out what the ending is. Okay? Okay. So, contrary to what you might expect, the thing that changes in the real world is not Madotsuki's willingness to go outside. Instead, a small little stepladder appears out on the balcony. And if you walk up to it... Madotsuki jumps off and presumably dies. This is the only ending that the game has to offer. This is the only thing that all of that wandering around leads up to. After playing a confusing, labyrinthine game that's been turning you around in its massive, yawning voids of abstract imagery, after succeeding in figuring out the game's twisted and sometimes nonsensical idea of puzzle design, after journeying in this girl's mind in search of answers or purpose, your only conclusion is the main character waking up, going out to the balcony, and killing herself. That kinda sucks, doesn't it? This game kinda sucks, doesn't it? Yep, it totally does. Let's talk about it. On the creator's official webpage of the game, and in its README file, it's explained that Yume Nikki has no particular story or purpose, and that it's a game where you just walk around. Which, I mean, yeah, I guess that's pretty accurate. It's a very blunt explanation, and that bluntness comes into harsh contrast with the game's nature as an abstract disaster, formed from disjointed ideas that somehow manage to carry enough of a symbolic through line to feel cohesive enough. Yume Nikki simultaneously deflects and invites analysis, utterly unconcerned with trying to be anything more than what it is, while still brimming with thematic potential. It's fascinatingly paradoxical, and the clearest way this comes through is how the game could not possibly care about actually being fun to play. This is less a video game, and more the intersection between an indie art exhibit and a scavenger hunt that hates you. Yume Nikki may be seen as a badly designed game by common sensibilities, but it poses questions of how much that actually matters, and to what extent a game can be carried by a strong aesthetic and little else. Questions that continue to be asked by other games that get called mean names, like Walking Simulator. The experience of playing Yume Nikki for the first time can be disorienting and uncanny. All 12 of the worlds stemming from the Nexus are either open voids, abstract mazes, or both, oftentimes with actually important things like effect-granting NPCs or gates to other worlds being extremely few and far between. Take Graffiti World, a map indicative of Yume Nikki's overall style, with strange floor tiles and an abstract image floating in the background to provide a foreboding yet colorful atmosphere. These floor tiles probably seem like complete nonsense during gameplay, but if seen zoomed out like so, you can see that, well, it is still kinda nonsense, but it does form two somewhat distinct images. By the way, here's an itty-bitty Medotsky for reference. This place is huge, and thus sensible game design would dictate that there's a lot of things to do in it. Right? No, there are exactly 3 points of interest here. Get the bicycle effect by finding it parked over here for some reason, go to the women's restroom, which does nothing, and over here, completely removed from all the actually eye-catching things, is an elevator that takes you somewhere else. Okay, so maybe that means that this is a game that's more about exploring and taking in the rich, dynamic, varied imagery, right? Well, maybe sometimes, but other times you'll be over here in Puddle World, a vast expanse of basically nothing except a bunch of puddles, lampposts, an umbrella someone laid on the ground, and another completely disconnected doorway to somewhere much more visually interesting. This brings us to the biggest obstacle in playing the game. Its level design is much larger than it really needs to be, often looping around on itself to further confuse matters, and despite just about every part of every map being unique, the heavy reliance on repetitive sprites and patterns and the large amounts of space between things that draw the eye lend to an exploration experience that's confusing and sometimes downright hostile. This bright red maze I've shown a couple of times and called hell as a joke is in fact called hell by the fans, and it's for a very good reason. Look at this eye-straining nightmare. And this is like a pivotal location between multiple different points in the dream world. You gotta walk around in all of this, like a lot. But even more so than hell, probably one of the best examples of Yume Nikki's harsh and antagonistic level design is Number World. Not only do the cartoonish patterns on the wall clash harshly with the rest of the game's aesthetic, not only is the map drawn in an isometric perspective when you're limited to cardinal movement, which the game does a lot, by the way, and not only are there random numbers written on the floor for no reason, but the image scrolling in the background of this world is an image of itself. The oppressive, crunchy music sounds right at home in a horror game, and as if all of that wasn't bad enough, Number World has some of Yume Nikki's most unsettling content, including the nightmarish Guillotine World, home to monstrous bird-faced girls named Toriningen. These girls are actually a recurring presence in her dreams, and while some of them are passive, others are in a crazed state and will chase you down, teleporting you to a sealed-off room if they catch you. They're the only thing in the entire game that you can call an enemy in the traditional sense, being the kind of chaser that's now a staple of this niche of games. The Hell Maze I mentioned before also has a few hostile girls running around, and a few other maps have them thrown in to keep you on your toes. They serve as a powerful reminder that these places are hostile and alien. Even disregarding the more overtly hostile worlds, almost everywhere in Yume Nikki is very unwelcoming. Regardless of how many characters or decorations litter the map, it still oftentimes feels empty because of how little those things usually do. At most, you'll get an NPC that has some sort of reaction to being interacted with or having a specific effect used nearby, but the majority of living things in this world flat out ignore you. There's no dialogue, no directions or guide besides the purely implied goal of getting all of the effects, and no rhyme or reason for where you are or where you're going to end up. Just you and Medotsky, wandering around trying to find something. Deep in her dreams, along dreary and sprawling sands, Medotsky can find a lively picnic. There are blankets laid out with little treats on them, cheerful music plays from the radio, and there are Toriningen happily walking and dancing around. But her path is blocked, leaving her isolated and unwelcome. There's no other choice but to turn back and traverse the endless desert in lonely quiet. The rest of the music does a lot for establishing Yume Nikki's heavy focus on atmosphere and generally saying as little as possible. A solid majority of the game's soundtrack, which you've been hearing a lot of up to this point, consists of atmospheric drones with very little identifiable melody, enhancing the strange feeling of emptiness found throughout the game's worlds. Some of these are calm and mysterious, like the music for Dark World. Whereas some songs are disorienting, repetitive loops, like Block World's theme. There are a few tracks that are much easier on the ears and have more of a tune to them, like the gloomy theme of the barracks settlement. But then in some places like the White Desert, you don't even get music, just uncanny sound effects. Regardless of their style, though, almost all of the songs of Yume Nikki have one thing in common. Their loops are really short. Most of the game's music files don't even go past 10 seconds long, and most of the ones that do are cheating because they're just other songs slowed down, meaning their melodies only go for 1 or 2 measures before repeating. Whether this was an intentional decision or just Kikiyama, the game's developer, wanting to lighten the load they had to do for this large soundtrack is unclear, but in any case, it gives the game a sort of hypnotic rhythm. It enhances the feeling that Yume Nikki is always moving along to its own tempo and expects the player to either follow along or be left behind. Further contributing to that feeling is the limited number of things you can actually do within the dream world. I mentioned earlier that most NPCs in the game just walk around ignoring you, and even though the effects offer the solutions to most of the game's puzzles, they usually lack any actual impact besides the one puzzle they're used for, if they have any practical use at all. The effects that directly influence NPC behavior, like the stoplight or cat effects, usually just interrupt or reposition characters instead of anything more meaningful. Within these worlds, the player, and by extension Medotsky, both act as outside observers, wandering along and having very little influence besides where they go next. Except that's actually a lie, because so many things in this game transport you without permission, sometimes only in one direction. It really makes trying to play this game without having the maps pulled up an absolute disaster. But, as you might be aware, there is exactly one exception to this. Because as it turns out, regardless of the NPC, regardless of what their purpose is or what interactions they might normally have, there's one effect that will always have a tangible, immediate impact on the world. The only way to meaningfully interact with most of the characters in the game is to equip the knife effect, and... I would personally hesitate to call Yume Nikki a horror game, since unsettling and scaring the player doesn't seem to be its primary motive. The creator even states in this little FAQ page that according to them, it isn't a horror game at all. But I also can't really blame anyone who disagrees when they end up finding something like this. But arbitrary definitions of genre aside, the game is creepy no matter how you look at it. Even basic elements of the game's style, like the empty looping worlds and the strange, abstract visuals, can come across as unsettling, or at least kinda alien. A well-known example comes from the sewers, where what seem to be holes in the wall can be peered through to see a variety of really freaky drawings, all vague amalgamations of various human body parts. Deeper in Medotsky's mind, though, we find probably the most impactfully gruesome imagery this game has to offer, in the White Desert. Along these monochromatic dunes, cartoonish body parts with bulging veins rise out of the dirt, crazy-eyed heads buried in the ground serve as tunnels, and creatures such as what the fans call the thing with the quivering jaw defy any sensible visual design, to the point that they have to be given names like Thing with the Quivering Jaw. Even Monoe, a seemingly normal girl found in this world, is meandering around a completely featureless black void and flashes this unpleasant sneer if you try interacting with her. Then there's the similar Monoko, yet another ordinary human girl walking around in this tunnel. At least until you use the stoplight effect, which causes her to mutate into this multi-armed form. It's creepy, and it just sort of happens at you, apropos of nothing, like most things in the game. But human body parts don't even need to be distorted and cartoonish to feature prominently, as Eyeball World proves. This is one of the 12 worlds you can get to from the Nexus, littered with dismembered eyeballs, arms grasping at thin air, and a number of blood-stained monsters. Yume Nikki isn't shy when it comes to blood and gore in its imagery, so when it does show up, it's always off-putting at the very least. A prominent example of this is in the dense woods, a fairly mundane forest area with eyes peering from the darkness, and a frog. Just a perfectly normal frog that also lets you be a frog. But there's a road cutting through these woods, and surrounded by traffic cones is a blood-stained corpse known to fans as Shitai-san. Shitai being Japanese for corpse. This, by the way, is where you get the stoplight effect, which pretty much cements that this is meant to represent a car crash victim. And given that I just said before that this is a game that lets you walk around with a frog head, a straightforward dead body is a very striking and realistic thing to be part of the dream world. The realism with which this bloody imagery is presented feels off, like this girl might be more familiar with violence than someone like her probably should be. And it's on that note that we should probably discuss the knife. The knife effect can be found in Dark World, an even more empty and void-like space than most of the other worlds in the game. Equip it, and Medotsky will gain the ability to stab most NPCs with a spurt of blood and this awful scream. It's no wonder that this act would stand out to most players of the game and would color fan portrayals of Medotsky for years. Compared to all of the weird nonsense going on in the rest of the game, killing an NPC with a kitchen knife is something jarringly visceral and real. So the fact that it's not only something you can do to almost every character, but is in fact the only thing you can do with most characters, is easy to interpret as being evidence that our player character may not be having very well-adjusted thoughts. Now, earlier I said there was one thing in Yume Nikki that you could call a jump scare, and since we're on the topic of Medotsky's potentially troubled psychology, I think it's finally time for us to talk about Uboa. Easily the most recognizable part of the game, this creature is given an unusual amount of build-up and focus compared to Yume Nikki's typical disjointed nature. But I'm not going to show you Uboa just yet. Instead, I'm going to walk you through the process of meeting it to give you an idea of the real impact of this character. One of the worlds you can access from the Nexus is the Snow World, and unlike every other world in the game, Snow World is part of a linear sequence of maps with none of the usual connecting threads to any other part of the dream world. It follows the same general model as the rest of the original 12 worlds, being an open expanse of almost nothing, but the visuals are much more mundane. Snow covers the ground, trees are dotted around the landscape, and there's an occasional igloo that you can duck into. One of those igloos contains a puddle, which, when approached, will transport you to the Pink Sea. It's definitely a more fantastical place, with its bright palette and balloons that transport you around the map, but its visuals are still pleasant and sensible. In the center of the map is a building that leads to the room of a girl named Poniko. Poniko's room is normal. It's quite possibly the most normal thing in the entire game besides Medotsky's own room. Poniko herself looks like she could be a peer of Medotsky's, or at least someone around her general age. She has this exasperated sort of look on her face and does what most NPCs do, that is to say, walking around and ignoring you, but it's still pleasant. The music in this area is a light, twinkling little melody, and there's a light switch you can use to make everything dark. Poniko doesn't really seem to mind either way. But something special has a very small chance of happening when you flip that light switch. A 1 in 64 chance, determined when you enter the room. If this happens, trying to turn out the lights will cause a flash, followed by everything in the room changing, and Poniko being replaced with this. One of the most pleasant and relaxing parts of the game is suddenly interrupted by this abstract entity, with the room warping and taking on a more menacing appearance with staring eyes and distorted faces. A single, harsh tone, usually interpreted as a scream, replaces the music as the screen shakes and rumbles. This is Uboa. Once it appears, you can't leave Ponycode's room through the door. It doesn't have any response to any of your effects. It's even the one NPC in the entire game that completely ignores the knife. The only thing you can do is walk up to it, upon which its face distorts, and you're transported to this screen. And then you're stuck. All you can do here is slowly trudge through this vague fluid as Uboa sits there and a gigantic creature looms in the background. The only way to escape this place is to either use an effect to return to the Nexus or pinch yourself awake. The significance and meaning of Uboa and everything surrounding it is a subject of fierce discussion, with Ponyco often also coming into question because of the striking mundanity of her appearance and how Uboa replaces her. Sometimes they're even treated as two sides of the same person. In any case, it's clear from the framing of this event that Uboa, whatever it may be, represents something intensely negative, possibly even traumatic. Yet there's one other event in the game that seems to be even more traumatic than the appearance of Uboa. In Number World, you'll find these strange zipper patterns with faces along the wall, and sometimes, this one right here, will have a sad face. If it does, you can equip the knife effect, stab it, and you'll tear open a bloody hole through the zipper. Doing this will bring you to a staircase where similar but distorted figures to those found in the Nexus hover in the background. Looming above the staircase is this googly-eyed blob named Kyukyu-kun, who just sits there, rubbing the handrail and smiling. Going up to the top of the stairs, there's a door that appears identical to the door leading out of Madotsuki's room. Unlike the real thing, you can actually open this door, but doing so will trigger this scene. After watching this for a short while, Madotsuki wakes up immediately. And that's actually important because very, very few things in the dream world will force her to wake up in this way, and all the other events that do so are much more innocuous. What exactly this image, the stairway, and the creepy blob represents is unclear. But again, this is a sequence that feels purposeful and direct in a way that a lot of the game's meandering around just doesn't capture. It's very charged with negative emotion and horror, just like the encounter with Uboa, and it raises all kinds of concerns about Madotsuki's mental state. And once you start trying to think about what all that might mean to Madotsuki, it starts begging the question of, what's going on with any of this? Yume Nikki's story, even saying there is one is a little bit difficult. There's no dialogue anywhere in the game, the ability to interact with other characters in the environment is extremely limited and far from intuitive, and nothing you ever see is explained by anyone at any time, ever. Madotsuki probably isn't even the player character's real name, since Madotsuki is actually just a Japanese word for a window and doesn't follow proper naming conventions. There's a hiragana there. You don't put those in your name. That's not how it works. Thing is, even with how wild and abstract the game can be, it's worth repeating that Yume Nikki's dream worlds all belong to the player character. Everything you see, from the freaky body horror to the sprawling forests to the effects themselves, comes from the mind of this one character, a girl whose first on-screen actions for most players will likely include refusing to leave her room. Why? Is there something out there that scares her? Is there something about herself that scares her? Is it even something she has a choice in? Those questions provide the closest thing to a narrative through line you're ever going to get in the game, and despite being a game that refuses to explain itself, it gives you a central mystery and then scraps of meaningful imagery and noticeable patterns in the game's themes in such a way that implicitly begs to be put together. The hollow and empty atmosphere, the fixation on disfigurement and body horror, the antagonistic figures within the dreams, the effects, they all feel like puzzle pieces that can be connected in some way to figure out why this girl is the way she is. There are even some things that get way more specific than that. Vomiting mouths are a very frequent visual motif, as is coughing up blood. Lopsided eyes are common across many creatures and feature prominently in the warped version of Poniko's room. There's also the game's weird fixation on Mesoamerican imagery, a lot of which can be traced back specifically to the style of the ancient Paracas people of South America. I could go on way longer than that and point way more things out, but right now I just want to illustrate that these patterns, when seen through the vast amounts of nonsense in the game, feel enticing, and they develop a sense of mystery to Medotsky's character. Absolutely everything can become feasible evidence to some kind of theory, and because of the abstract and open-ended nature of the game, and really of dreams themselves, no theory is any more true than the other. The real driving force behind all of this, though, is the ending. The fact that this game ends with the main character jumping off of her balcony without any kind of fanfare and just as little explanation as anything else, of course players are gonna wanna know why. It's such an awful and horrific thing to see, and it's the kind of thing that someone only does when pushed to their absolute limit. What's especially interesting is that even though Yume Nikki has had plenty of extra media produced based on it, including a whole other video game that I'll probably be talking about at some point, it's all taken as interpretive and not a perfect reflection of the source material. Even after all of these years, after all this time to explain everything and lay out the reasons behind all these dreams, there is no canonical explanation. I mentioned the name Kikiyama offhandedly before without really explaining who that is, but there's a good reason for that, and it's because nobody knows. All that exists of Kikiyama on the internet is a few blog posts from the early development of Yume Nikki, some music they've produced in their spare time, an interesting but pretty intentionally veiled interview by Toby Fox, and apparently some very polite and unassuming email replies from decades ago that I haven't been able to find. They're definitely still around, what with the interview and the new game and everything, but there's absolutely zero biographical information on them besides that they are probably from Japan. We don't even know their gender, and although people generally assume that Kikiyama's one person, even that could be wrong. Because of the developer's distance and subsequent complete lack of any explanations, the fan theories about Medotsky's character range wildly. Some interpretations see her as being mentally deranged, a girl that not only thinks and dreams of violence, but may have even perpetrated it. Others see her as a survivor of abuse and trauma. Some claim that her fears and anxieties are much more mundane and are simply exaggerated and made more abstract in her dreams. The list goes on and on. I don't want to go too far into detail regarding any of these theories because while they do exist and are great discussion points, my intention with this video is to stay pure to what Yume Nikki is, rather than what I think it might be or what I interpret it as. The beauty of this kind of game is that there is no correct answer, and that everyone's going to piece things together in a different way. Really, in a way, playing Yume Nikki ends up reflecting just as much on the player as it does on the girl they control. All of the insane characters and varied atmospheres are almost impossible to take in all at once, and the player is free to go through the game in whatever way and with whatever theories they think fit best. Even the act of playing the game leads to wildly varied differences in what the player gets out of it. You all probably know by now that Uboa is practically Yume Nikki's mascot at this point, but remember, it only has a 1 in 64 chance to show up. Plenty of other things in the game have similarly random chances, like a specific section of wall in the Famicom world you can talk to that'll start glitching out, or figures falling out of the sky as you ascend a giant step pyramid. And something else to remember, this game came out in 2004. Information was far less centralized on the internet during that time, and Yume Nikki's fanbase consisted of people on image boards sharing their findings and joining together in their attempts to figure out just what was going on here. It's no wonder people are still talking about this game. When you look at the indie landscape today, you can see that it had the formula of a surreal cult classic down before pretty much anyone else. In refusing to give answers to any of the many, many questions it poses, Yume Nikki has given the world a mystery people are still pondering over all these years later. If there's any takeaway I want you guys to have from this, I don't want it to be that Kikiyama was some mysterious savant who broke all the rules of video games in their endless, glorious wisdom. That kind of mythologization of the auteur-developer can make meaningful art feel out of reach for the average person, and just reinforces the oppressive culture of exceptionalism that exists in a lot of these spaces. Part of what makes Yume Nikki so important is that it actually proves the opposite point. That the motivation behind this game is the kind of thing everyone can find in themselves. When you make art with passion and indulge in your ideas, your thoughts and experiences connect to those of your audience, and you make something resonant and beautiful. It's the core of why Indie RPG Maker exists as its own niche of games. RPG Maker's whole thing is to let everyone make games, because when you let everyone make art, you give people the chance to express themselves in ways no one's seen before. And using that, Yume Nikki was able to show large parts of the world that even a bunch of manic ideas with barely any narrative and even less gameplay can still be full of meaning to so many people. For me personally, living as someone who struggles to navigate the abstractness of emotion and my feelings in general, I find myself drawn to art that can represent those difficult, complicated things where the simply spoken word fails. That is one of the unique powers of art, and it can only be made manifest when true, unfaltering emotion is put into it. Years would pass before Yume Nikki caught on, but once it did, you started to see all kinds of games following its example. From explicit fan games like Yume Nikki and Dot Flow, to games that would take the same engine and philosophy to different places, like Eve and The Witch's House. Then the waves grew bigger, and games following Yume Nikki's lead, like Lisa and One Shot, would see even greater success. And let's talk about Undertale. Sure, the gameplay and narrative set it apart in a big way, but it followed the same model of being an incredibly simple game compared to what was being released at the time, driven by the passion the developer had and whatever weird ideas came to their mind. Also, there are so many similarities between these two games and how they present themselves that when I first played Undertale, I spent the first hour or so worried that I was gonna start throwing surreal horror at me. The point here is, anyone could make a game like Undertale, just like anyone could make a game like Yume Nikki. And it's only because people have kept making games like Yume Nikki that we got a game like Undertale. It is the purest distillation of creative passion that you can find in this medium. And even though it doesn't line up with any standardized definition of quality, who cares? If you make the things you want to make, nothing else matters. That alone is what makes it beautiful.